This afternoon, I would like to talk to you about cultural and spiritual blindness. I'll be reflecting on the text in Mark chapter 8, verses 14 to 26. This particular story follows the miracle of Jesus feeding 4,000 men and women and children who are at a place that's very isolated where there's no food. You can go back and read that story. It's a wonderful story, again, of a miracle of Jesus providing bread in a place where there's nothing for people to eat. Once the situation is finished and Jesus and the disciples get into a boat and they start back across the Sea of Galilee. At this particular point, the disciples discover that in spite of all those basketfuls of remnants left over, they only have one loaf of bread. And so at this point, they start complaining to each other or talking to each other about having forgotten bread. Jesus breaks into their conversation and he says this to them: "Be careful. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." Now again, the disciples begin a conversation about that. What is he talking about? Why is he talking about yeast? Is it because we didn't bring any bread with us? And as Jesus listened to them, he asked, "Why are you asking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember?" And then he asked them, "When I broke 5 loaves of bread for 5,000, how many pieces did you pick up?" And they replied, 12 baskets full. And he says, "When I broke 7 loaves, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" And again, they said 7. And then he asked them, "Do you still not understand?" Why didn't they understand? Well, first of all, they were just preoccupied with food. And they couldn't think about where they're going to get their next meal. And so this is on their minds, and they're blinded to what Jesus is asking. But it's more than just that. They're blinded to what Jesus is doing. They can't see spiritually what he's up to, because their expectations and their understanding of what a man is and what a man can do, Jesus is just breaking all of their expectations. And so at this point, Jesus has done so many miracles. He has taken them places. He's even sent them out to preach the good news. He sent them out to heal the sick. They even did that. But they still don't understand. They're culturally blind and they're spiritually blind. Now the miracle is that God works through culturally blind and spiritually blind people. And he worked through these disciples, but they still didn't get it. It says that sometime later they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. The story that follows, then, is a metaphor for cultural and spiritual blindness, and I want to reflect on it with you in that framework. The text says he took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. Now, if you go back and read through the gospel, you'll see that many times Jesus took his disciples out of the crowds, away from them, and out into a quiet place where he could talk to them alone, one-on-one. And so this is very similar to what he's done with his disciples. The text says he spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, and he asked, "Do you see anything?" The man looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Now this is a wonderful insight into blindness. That as this man begins to see, he can't see clearly. And what he sees doesn't make sense to him. And this is exactly what Jesus has been saying to his disciples. Don't you understand? In spite of the miracle of the 5 loaves and the 12 baskets full they picked up, in spite of Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee in the darkness, and they see him and they think he's a ghost, in spite of the fact that Jesus feeds another 4,000, they still don't understand. They're fixated on bread. They're fixated on the way they think about him. They're fixated on their understandings of what a person is and what a person can do. And they just don't understand. Jesus is to them like a tree walking around. They just don't comprehend who he is. Now, in this story of the blind man, it says once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened and his sight restored, and he saw everything clearly. I'm going to suggest to you that this story is here because it represents a turning place in the gospel. If you go back and look at the Gospel of Mark, each section ends with a question like the one that Jesus ends with here. Don't you still understand? Why don't you still believe? What is the problem with your comprehension and understanding of who I am? And so right after this blind story, Jesus asked them a question again. He says, who do you think that I am? But this healing is a wonderful illustration, because at this point, they were still struggling to comprehend who Jesus was. At the end of the first section of Mark, they're on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus wakes up in the boat, and he stills the sea and calms the waves and calms the wind. And they say, who is this man? They can't understand who he is. Well, at this point, they begin to understand. The text tells us that Jesus asked them again, who do people say I am? And they answer with the same stuff. Well, some people say you're John the Baptist. Some people say that you're Elijah. Some people say you're a prophet. And then he says point blank, who do you say that I am? And after a time of quiet, Peter says, you are the Messiah. And at that point, Jesus says to them, at last, but don't tell anybody else. And then he begins to talk to them about how he is going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to suffer much from the elders and the chief priests and the Pharisees and the rulers. And he will die, and he will be raised again. And again, they cannot understand. They can't imagine, because that's not in their mind of what the Messiah is and what the Messiah could and should be. So I want you to see that the mental scripts that these disciples had was a mental script that Jesus just didn't fit in at all. He was not what they expected. He was not what they could understand. And as Jesus lived and worked on the ground in their relationships, they had no clue as to what he was doing and why it was happening in this way. They just couldn't process it. It was outside of their understanding. It was outside of their history, outside of their expectations, outside of their knowledge. And so they just couldn't comprehend this, even though they were right there with Jesus, watching him do these incredible things. Now, your assignment for this week is to read the book Pearl of China. And in this book, Pearl of China, you see a Christian missionary, Absalom Seidenstreicher, in the late 1800s, going into China and trying to preach the gospel to Chinese people. Absalom is not Jesus. Absalom does no miracles. And the gospel that he preaches makes just as much nonsense to the Chinese as it did to the disciples when Jesus was trying to preach them and teach them. So I want you to reflect on this as you read this book. You will see that all the characters suffer from cultural blindness and spiritual blindness. And they struggle to understand this gospel that Absalom is bringing about Jesus who was crucified. And they can't comprehend a God who was killed in such a way and then rose again. It makes no sense at all in terms of their culture. And so as you see Absalom struggling to bring this gospel to these people, keep remembering that the disciples struggled to try to understand Jesus when he was right there among them. And he was right there teaching them and talking to them and doing these great miracles. They just couldn't get it. And Absalom, as he struggles to bring the gospel to the Chinese, he had even worse problems. They could not comprehend. They could not understand. And they thought it was all just completely nonsense. So as you read this book, I'd like for you to think deeply about this. What is the Chinese cultural blindness? In this text, Jesus talks about the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. Now you need to find out what that means. You need to go back and look at the text. The yeast of the Pharisees is unpacked in Mark 7, 1-23. And if you look at that, you'll see that Jesus confronts it pretty frankly, straightforward. The yeast of Herod is unpacked in Mark chapter 6, verses 14-29. You see the story of Herod there and his execution of John the Baptist, and you can see his cultural blindness, and you can see his spiritual blindness, and you can see how he's driven by power and by the kinds of things that just are, to him, the essence of life. The Chinese are also blind. They're blind like Herod. They're blind like the Pharisees. And if you look at this, I'd like for you to ask yourself, what is equivalent among the Chinese to the yeast of the Pharisees? What is equivalent among the Chinese to the yeast of Herod? But the Chinese are not the only ones that are blind, both spiritually and culturally. Absalom, Sidon Stryker, the missionary, is culturally blind. He's blind to their culture, and he's blind to his own. And he's also spiritually blind. He can't see how God is working and what God is doing in that context. So my question to you is, how does God use a man so blind to reach so many with the gospel? Think about that. And then his wife Carrie. What is Carrie's cultural and spiritual blindness? Her loneliness, her isolation, her longing for America. And yet, how does God use her, her compassion for the Chinese poor around her, to reach them with the gospel? And then we have the story of their daughter, Pearl. Pearl is an unusual case because Pearl is utterly in tune with the Chinese culture. She understands them perfectly, and she understands her parents perfectly. And as a consequence, she's deeply conflicted. She sees her parents' cultural blindness. She sees the blindness of the Chinese to what her parents are trying to do. And she's conflicted in a love-hate relationship with her father and in her deep love for her mother, and then her deep love for the Chinese people around her. How does God use this conflicted, doubting Pearl to touch Willow, Dick, and others with the gospel? This is an intriguing thing about this story. I want to conclude with this statement. Jesus calls the culturally blind to do his work, even when they can only see people as trees walking around. Even when they can only see people as trees walking around, Jesus does his work. So how do you see this happening in this book, Pearl of China? How do you see this happening in your own life and ministry?